Hello and welcome everyone to this talk about effective designer-developer collaboration. My name is Michael Geig and I lead the UI UX Tech Center in our professional services division. So you probably think of me as a designer, but very few know that I was hired as an application developer, that I have my master's in computer science, and for my diploma thesis, I digitized floor plans of our faculty and I built an application that detects the position of a mobile user based on the access points they are logged into. And that was based on ArcGIS 3 and the HTML viewer, if you still remember. I grew up with C++, Turbo Pascal, and Ada. Yes, go figure that one. So my bread and butter was in LAMP land, was PHP, ASP, later Java, Silverlight, you know, been there, done that. During my studies, I worked part-time for IBM, doing AS400 installations, and I built websites at a time when companies were eager to get their website address on business cards, next to the other three email addresses. I built my first website in 1993. It was optimized for Mosaic. Later, when CSS came around, I optimized it for Netscape, complete with iframes and animated GIFs, obviously. And that was long before Internet Explorer took over. When I started at Esri in 2003, I was the button guy. Later, I became the beautifier. Now I'm sitting here discussing the difference between designers and developers. So, what are the differences between an artiste and a code monkey? I used to think from the brain. Now I think from the heart. I've never owned a MacBook Pro or Apple for that respect, but I used to have long hair and trendy sideburns. Now my beard is so long that my kids ask me for Christmas presents in September. I still love esoteric t-shirts, fanny packs, and stylish hats. And sometimes I annoy my clients by shouting out that I need more research. But sometimes I also just love to say, hey, just give me the specs. I crank it out. So what does that make me? And the answer probably doesn't really matter because what designers and developers have in common is a strong desire to make a product successful. And by make, I mean to design and build. But what makes a product successful? It's the people, the process, and the language. And by people, I mean developers, designers, product engineers, quality assurance, release managers, product owners, in short, the team. So let's talk about those three topics in more detail, starting with the people. Regardless of whether we are talking about product or project development, we need a team of people that cover a spectrum of jobs to be done that ranges from very human focused on the left hand side to very tech focused as seen on the right hand side. So where do designers and developers fall on this spectrum? Typically, when we think about an application developer, we know that there's a distinction between the front end and the back end, and we make the distinction mostly by architecture. That means whether the code is developed using client-side or server-side technology. But there's actually another type of developer, the user interface or UI developer, who also covers design. Sometimes we refer to the UI development as the front end and the application development as the back end front end. And I give you a second to digest that. But last but not least, there's also the user experience or UX designer that has an eye on the vision, how the things will behave and look from a holistic perspective. The UX designer does a lot of research and should work hand in hand with the product engineer. Understanding this spectrum is important when I start talking about the process because historically we focused on working with the developers only, but it became evident that it is important to also include UI developers and UX designers in the mix. The only question is, How? Which takes me to our approach number one. Now that we know the roles that people play, let's take a look at how they work together. One very common process is that somebody, your manager, the product engineer, or your client, creates a PowerPoint document with design ideas. The team then meets with this client to do quote unquote requirements gathering, also known as let's make a list of all the functionality we see on the screen, which we then slap on the desk of our lead developer. Then the development team kicks into gear and builds this thing. The process is that developers develop. Pretty straightforward, right? But will this result in a quality product? Many years ago, we've realized that this just doesn't work. We need to do design upfront. So approach 2 became designer designs and developers sit around. Then there's a single handover and the developers develop and the designer sits around. And designer singular, developers plural, which is very common that developers outnumber designers by a large number. So what we've learned is that this single handover just doesn't work either, because as a designer, I cannot just go away for some weeks and then come back and show you the solution and then cross my fingers that my designs will be implemented the way they were envisioned to be. And as a developer, I cannot just take the specs and without understanding why they are as they are, crank them out. So over the years, there has been one recurring theme that I hear from our clients. We are worried about time. They want to get going, and I don't disagree. And there's still no guarantee that the end product is great. But how can we fix this process? And I'm suggesting to follow the hot potato process, a term coined and promoted by Brad Frost and Dan Moll. It suggests that first we need to involve designers and developers all the way through and in parallel. Then we work together to get things done. We might start with a design session. We designers hate including other people in our beautiful design craft because only we know how to design right. But I promise you, we pay you guys back during pair programming. Well, the idea here is to have multiple handovers between designers and developers and vice versa. By the way, the handovers on this chart are randomly placed just to show you that they happen continuously for the entirety of a product creation cycle. So lastly, we also need to engage the rest of the team and the stakeholders in regular design checkpoints. Those checkpoints might be a walkthrough, like how does the design match up with the business problems to solve, or a critique, which is a review of an in-progress design to assess whether it meets its agreed upon design objectives and what can we learn from this design we've created. Or a demo. What is the user's experience when using the design? Or a review. Is the design ready to moving forward and are there still issues to resolve? This process of continuous involvement and multiple design checkpoints is superior to what we currently follow. But it still has its pros and cons, which I want to discuss in the next couple of minutes. So let's dive right into it. Let's look at the pros. The first advantage is that we understand the constraints, limitations, and feasibility of something early. Designers tend to dream up the craziest design ideas, and for that it's good to have a reality check from the technical side. Building the right thing means that we are able to adjust the design direction before we end up in a cul-de-sac. Success means that the team wants the project to not fail. And that is only possible if the team understands why something has to be built in a certain way. It's important to make mistakes earlier because it's cheap. Adjusting direction down the road is exponentially more expensive, and that adds risk and cost. We are able to show progress often. We design smaller things faster. We make sure everybody is on the same page. Let's start thinking in terms of minimum viable artifact, which will lead us to a stronger product overall. And lastly, a thing I see happening often is that towards the end, the team starts hustling and fiddling to get things done, and there's nobody that has time to clean up the broken windows, which in total will make the house look old and ugly. So a collaborative approach throughout the complete project will end up with less broken windows towards the end. On the flip side, there are cons too, like the process might feel a little clumsy or intimidating at first. And that's why it's important to explain the benefits and help to establish trust. And yes, there will be some additional churn to start with, but our goal is still quality, and that's exactly why we're doing this hot potato or everyone is involved process. So we do not need 2 months of upfront work before we can even get started. Not everybody can do everything, of course, but we need to work to close those gaps, to expand our roles, have a designer learn about styled components and a developer learn about CSS Grid and Flexbox. Incremental over innovation is a potential problem which states that we focus too much on the small things and we lose sight of the big picture. So we need to have a dedicated UX person or a product engineer, PE, keep track of the vision so we don't get bogged down in features and functions. And finally, let's don't fall trap into this Henry Ford thing and become slave to the process. Remember, quality is still priority, so we need to adjust our process to our needs and capabilities. To wrap up the process section, hot potato worked for us. Remember the example I gave you initially? If we had implemented the app according to the specs, we'd have run into lots of unknowns soon. Would have started to clutter the interface with all the new requests and adjustments, that trickle in over time. That's just a natural process, and especially we would have never arrived at an application that is usable, presentable, and maybe even a little bit stunning. So what we did was we started with a meeting where designers, developers, and clients talked about the business and the end user needs. We asked for permission to deviate from the PowerPoint drafts, which felt like a relief to even the client. And then as the designers created the wireframes and the mockups, we regularly involved the developers to adjust its visibility. We kept the client in loop via email. Nothing fancy really, but very effective when it comes to approvals to move into development, which behind the scenes had been on its way already anyway. Lots of things to set up, to figure out before the first designs trickle in. In later iterations of the app, we followed the same process, involving the whole team to make decisions on how to best adjust the interface and the app. And overall, I have to say the process went smooth and everybody is really pleased with the end result. So to us, we consider this as a success story. Great. Now let's talk about language. Language is the basis of communication and understanding. Without speaking the same language, we are bound to fail. So we need to agree on the terminology to use. What is a component, a widget, a template? It doesn't matter what it is really. What matters is that the team agrees on what it is. Let's get this out of the way early. Also, use pattern libraries. Pattern libraries have many advantages. The biggest benefit is that they describe solutions to observed and recurring design problems, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. But they also provide a language for planning and building apps. They give patterns a name. For example, the hamburger button reveals the drawer navigation, or it's best to combine the unified search with the locate me button, or any full map application needs a focal point. I guess you get the idea here. We are using patterns and the terminology to describe the things instead of coming up with our own words as we go. Those patterns not only give our solutions a name, but they also describe how to best use and implement them. Which brings me to the second point. Having a design system will naturally help the team defining this terminology. It also provides a system of best practices that ideally follow the insights and research of UI pattern libraries like the ones I just mentioned before, and other efforts like accessibility. Maybe you have your own design system. If you do, I congratulate you. But if not, Esri has just announced the release of its very own design system that comes with design guidelines, a responsive and accessible web components, a nice set of icons, and much more. So having a design system might come with some overhead upfront, but it will speed up the process later on. Just consider a situation where we need a new control on the interface. Isn't it nice to being able to consult the design system and pick the right tool that we know already exists and doesn't have to be designed and implemented anymore? Because this central repository of institutional knowledge of those best practices helps us level set our process and will free us to focus on more important questions and get more meaningful work done. Designers can now focus on interaction diagrams instead of adjusting colors and margins, and developers can spend their time on edge cases rather than building this authentication thing once again. Design systems save the organization money and agony. But UX designers, UI and application developers, they need to work together to design and build it. And because we want to get you started, I recommend the following sessions. You can look them up and listen to them. And they describe really well how to use Esri's new design system to get up to speed with your development. And last but not least, the tools. Throughout the presentation, I've avoided talking about tools because people and processes are more important to success than tools. But there's one point I want to make. Speaking the same language also means using the same tools. And therefore, designers need to get on GitHub and use Visual Studio Code to create branches and pull requests. And developers shouldn't be intimidated opening a link to a prototype from Adobe XD, Figma, or InVision. The understanding of each other's tools is the basis for collaboration. So please, please, please get acquainted with the idea to learn new tools. I also highly recommend using balsamic wireframes during your conceptual design process. It allows the team to explore the solution space and produce easy to understand visuals in a fast and inexpensive way, which is perfect for iterating over possible solutions and to identify gaps and holes early in the process. If you're using version 4, you will find it easy to include these ready-to-go map control components, which speed up the process even further. And these stencils are truly amazing, and I'm not only saying this because I've created them, okay? Well, finally, on our team, we also have a license for Balsamic Cloud that integrates nicely with Wireframes 4 and allows us to share the wireframes with the developers and our clients. They can add comments, they can even go in and propose changes by creating alternate versions, which I love because they essentially start doing my job. Well, Okay, I'm sad to say that this is it for today already. Let's break down the barriers between designers and developers, get to know each other's strengths and weaknesses, and start working on meaningful things early and collaborate as a team. And I leave you with this Dilbert joke where the designer comes to the engineer and says, I didn't know how to design a power supply, so I put a nail in a piece of wood. I'm on vacation tomorrow, so I'll give you my files in case you need to make changes. And hey, once I had that idea, it all came together pretty quickly. I hope that doesn't happen to you. Please um, provide your feedback for this session. And don't forget to watch my other talk on UI UX best practices for designing stunning web apps. Um, I explain many of the concepts that you might find useful. And with that, I wish you good luck with your next endeavor. Thank you very much for listening and see you next time.